I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. This is a podcast episode brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Welcome back to our Dvarim series titled Torah from Our Teachers. I'm back from my vacation and we're coming to you with new content each week. Moshe is our greatest human teacher, and the book of Dvarim includes his monumental addresses to the nation. Each week, our guests are sharing with us Torah learned from their most influential teachers. This week's episode has been sponsored by Lauren Shacham and Ariel, Ilana, and Natan Winter in honor of Rabbi Ed and Bobby Winter's 59th wedding anniversary. Mazal Tov, and may they go from strength to strength. For those of you who love listening weekly, sponsoring an episode is a wonderful way to show your gratitude for the high-level content we try and put out each week. For more information, contact me at podcast@matan.org.il or the Matan office. Parshat Ki Tavo opens with the bringing of one's first fruits to the Mikdash and the moving verbal recitation that accompanies it. This and the section that comes right after will be the focus of today's conversation. The elders are then commanded to record the Torah on monuments, which will later be erected in the land of Israel. This is followed by a series of blessings and curses, which are to be recited at the mountains of Grizim and Eval in Israel, an event which indeed takes place in the book of Yoshua. This is followed by what is usually called the blessings and curses, 14 verses describing the fecundity and providence that is bestowed upon those who follow God's commandments, and 54 verses describing the horrific phenomenon that befall those who don't listen to God's commands. In the past, we spoke about how stipulations of blessings and curses were part of all vassal treaties, and that this is the renewal of the treaty for the next generation by the hills of Moab before they enter into Israel. The curses are traditionally read in a lowered voice. They really are disturbing in their descriptions of infertility of humans in the land, war, looting, plagues, rape, captivity. I'll be honest, these curses are difficult to read at this moment. So many of them seem to have come true in the past 3 years, if not just in the past year alone. We've entered into the month of Elul. This is actually being recorded in Rosh Chodesh Elul, and this annual time of introspection overwhelms me more than it inspires me at the moment. There's so much we need to do better. I think that the biggest challenge for me this year is that the introspection will be done with a national eye. How can I do better for us? I can't say I'm very interested right now in bettering my daily observance. That feels too narrow. But how can I better the community, the nation? That is what occupies my thoughts as I go about my mundane routines of family life, routines that often become too consuming, that they're hard to transcend. While we can't really ever neglect the personal work of our daily observance, it just seems that the other issues are more critical for our survival at the moment. What are you thinking about this, Elul? Write me. I'd be moved to hear from you. Today's conversation is with Rabbi Jeff Sachs, founding director of Atid, and its Web Yeshiva program. He is the editor of the Tradition Journal. Rabbi Sachs is the series editor of the Shai Agnon Library at the Toby Press and the director of research at the Agnon House in Jerusalem. He has published widely on Jewish thought, education, literature, and I last had him in the 50s series, meaning I had him 2 years ago on the podcast, and I'm thrilled that he's joining us again today. Jeff, it's great to have you back on the podcast.
Great to be back, Yosefa.
So we're sitting here today sort of with a two-pronged focus. One is, of course, always the parsha. We're going to be speaking about Parshat Ki Tavo. And we're also going to be highlighting a teacher who was significant for you, Rabbi Bravender, who we'll get to also as our conversation continues. So Parshat Ki Tavo is, at the beginning at least, is rather unusual because we have two sections that come one right after one another, that already many of the commentators noticed that the second one, which is the content regarding Trumot and Ma'asrot, is one that in actuality we actually spoke about in Perek Yud Daled in Sefer Dvarim. Mm-hmm. But it seems to be placed here because we have these two places where we have an exclamation or a speech that a person has to make. The first is when they bring their bikurim, they bring their first fruits, and the second is when they're doing something perhaps called Viduy Ma'asrot, and again, you'll go deeper into that section. And I just want to sort of start off by saying that while we're very used to being a very verbalized religion, we say brachot, and we have all these Yehi Ratzons in our sidurim, this is actually the only place that we have something like this, I think, in the Torah, because this verbalization of our lives and of our religious lives is something that's developed much more with Chazal than it was really present initially in the Torah. And so when we come to these declarations in Perek Kaf Vav and Sefer Dvarim, there's actually something very unique, and I also think very exciting. When you're reading it through the genuine, like, biblical eyes, all of a sudden it's the person who speaks. It's the person who will even see who there's a focus on them as a person and not just on them as part of the people.
Right. Well, that's a really interesting insight. It's true. I mean, our listeners, of course, know that there are all types of speech acts in Judaism and in Halacha. If you want to eat dinner on Friday night, first you have to recite Kiddush. But this is, of course, a rabbinic ordinance. Kriyat Shema, which, even if biblical, there's nowhere in the Chumash that says every day a person should say this. We learn that, Chazal learned that out as being a biblical obligation. But here in Parshat Ki Tavo, we have these two declarations, these two speeches, almost as if we're given the script. Here, say this. Part of the ritual is to recite this set text. And the truth is, we learn out from this section certain halachot about other speech acts. But that's a side topic. But these two declarations, the declaration of somebody who brings his or her bikurim to the Beit HaMikdash, the Jew enters Eretz Yisrael, we fight the war of kibush v'chiluk, we conquer the land and we divide it up and we settle it, and then the laws of the agricultural principles come into play, except in this particular case, we don't even have to wait that long, because as the reader knows, the parsha opens, V'haya ki tavo el haaretz asher Hashem Elokecha noten lecha nachal la v'yirishta. Right? That something about entering the land of Israel changes our reality to mitzvot, and there are all of these obligations that are incumbent upon us, and you and I, and of course probably many of our listeners in English, both those that are here with us in Israel and those that are listening from abroad, make their way to Israel and discover that there are all types of obligations which today have been largely outsourced to mashgichei kashrut and to the supermarkets, and it's unless somebody is growing pomegranates in their backyard, as we might do, you and I here in Efrat, people don't always encounter on a regular daily personal basis. They go to the store, they check the hashgacha, but one of the obligations in the times of the Mikdash was to bring your bikurim, your first fruits, up to the Mikdash as part of your aliyah, l'regel. The second mitzvah here is what's called, colloquially by Chazal, is called Viduy Ma'asrot, the confession of the tithes. And it's connected to a different mitzvah, which, as you pointed out, appears in Parshat Re'eh a few weeks ago, called Bi'ur Ma'asrot. Now, this is a little more complicated and, frankly, a little less familiar. I remember, having read Parshat Ki Tavo a number of times and, not being a complete novice to Jewish life, I remember arriving in Israel. I came in Aliyah 30 years ago. I just celebrated the 30th anniversary of my Aliyah. And that Pesach, I was a guest in someone's home. I think it was that year. I'll have to check the calendar. I'm pretty sure it was that very first year. And the person said, we have Viduy Ma'asrot today. And I, very embarrassed to say, said, what's that? They said, in Parshat Ki Tavo, the second Aliyah. And I knew that it was written there, but I had no idea that this was an actual thing that is practiced. Now, the reality is that it's not exactly clear to what degree it is or is not in force, even though as a minhag, minimally a minhag, a custom, it has seemed to have returned with greater force in recent years. But briefly, for our listeners who may be unfamiliar with this, the Torah says that every time you bring in your crops, you separate the trumot, the ma'asrot, ma'aser rishon, which goes to Levi, and ma'aser sheni, the second tithe, which is your property, but you have to bring it with you when you go to Yerushalayim on the Shalosh Regalim, and you eat the food, you eat that produce as part of your celebration of the Chag. If you're unable to get to Yerushalayim in time before it would rot, or if it's such a great quantity that it's not practical to transport it to Yerushalayim, you can be podeh, you can redeem it, you can transfer its value onto money, and then you use that money to buy food to sustain you and your family as you celebrate the holiday in Yerushalayim. twice every 7 years, twice every Shemitah cycle, after the 3rd year and after the 6th year, you have to make this accounting. You have to go through your storehouses and make sure you didn't leave anything behind. Make sure you didn't. If you can imagine somebody who sets aside money for tzedakah, like you have a coin in your pocket and you set it aside. You say this $1 or this 10 shekels is for tzedakah. Well, you have to make sure that it actually gets to the charitable cause, right? So it's something of that nature that you have to check to see that all this food that you set aside actually gets to where it's supposed to be. And that's after the 3rd year, because remember, the cycle goes like this. In the 7-year Shemitah cycle, year 1 and 2, and year 4 and 5, we separate this Maaser Sheni, the food that we take up with us. Year 3 and 6, we separate Maaser Ani. It's an additional bonus charitable tithe to the poor. So at the end of the first mini cycle within the Shemitah, at the end of the 3rd year and at the end of the 6th year, you have to do this accounting, and then you have to make this declaration. Of course, the 7th year is Shemitah, and no tithes are separated. We're now on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, and this upcoming Rosh Hashanah, Tavshin Pei Hey, is the 3rd year of the Shemitah cycle. So this coming year, we'll have Maaser Ani. And then the following year, Tavshin Pei Vav, which will come out in 2026, we'll do Viduy Ma'asrot next. Chazal learn out that when's like the tax day? The tax year goes from January 1st to December 31st, but tax day is not until April 15th, a number of months later, because you need time to get organized. So that day, as it were, where you have to make sure that you've had everything removed, and then you make this declaration, that is Pesach of the following year, Pesach of the 4th year, and Pesach of the 7th year, of the actual Shemitah year. Without going into the details of all the very many machlokot on when it's done, the general understanding is the food would have to have been removed and given over and taken care of by Erev Pesach of the 4th and 6th year, and this declaration is made, according to most opinions, on the last day of Yom Tov of Pesach of the 4th and 6th year. Now, what is this declaration? So, shall we look at the psukim? These are the psukim in Dvarim Perek Kafav 26, beginning with pasuk Yud Bet 12. כי תחלל לעשור כל מעשר תבואתך בשנה השלישית, שנת המעשר, ונתת ללוי, לגר, ליתום, לאלמנה, ואכלו בשעריך ושבעו. You, at the end of this period of time, you've given over everything from the produce. And then what do you have to do? That's a reference to the Biur Ma'asrot, to make sure. Also
just notice it's a reference not to only this Maaser Ani, meaning there's a general reference.
All of your tithes and all of the gifts that have to be given to the produce, everything was taken care of. You squared it all the way.
Which is why why Parsha Parshat have a very hard time with this, because they say, well, it's not really about only what happens in the 3rd year, and they get all complicated. But your explanation is really what Chazal learned.
We're trying to simplify it.
Exactly how Chazal
And then when you've done it, we say, Ve'amarti lefnei Hashem Elokecha, biarti hakodesh min habayit. Biarti, since this is something that's recited on Pesach, we're all going to have on our minds biur chametz, right? It doesn't mean I've burned it. Biur means to
eradicate.
Yeah, I've gotten it rid. I've taken care of it. I've removed it from my house. Biarti hakodesh min habayit. I have removed these sanctified foods from my home. V'gam natati leLevi lager liyatom la'amana kechol mitzvotecha asher tzivitani. I gave it to everybody who was deserving and who was supposed to get it, and I did the mitzvah exactly as I was commanded. Lo avarti mi mitzvotecha v'lo shachachti. I didn't transgress the mitzvah, and neither did I neglect to do it. Neither did I forget to do it. And then the pasuk lists various other things in which he says that details of how it's done. I didn't do it when I was tamei, when I was in a state of impurity, which would cause a problem for the mitzvah, and I didn't do other things. Shamati bekol Hashem Elokai va'asiti kechol asher tzivitani. I listened to God's voice. I did, and He repeats again. I have done exactly what I was commanded to do. And now, listen up, God. Since I did what I'm supposed to do, hashkifa mima'on kodshecha min hashamayim. Look down upon us, gaze upon us from your heavenly heights. Uvarech et amcha Yisrael, and bless the people of Israel. V'et ha'adama asher natata lanu, and the land you have given us. Kasher nishbata lavotenu eretz zavat chalav udvash, as you have promised to give us this wonderful, bountiful land flowing with milk and honey. Right? In other words, we're strong-arming God. We're saying, listen, you gave me a mitzvah. You know what I did that mitzvah? I did it exactly. Not one iota was left out. And since I kept my end of the deal, you have to keep your end of the deal, and you have to bless us, and you have to bless the land. It's a beautiful idea, but it's quite unusual.
I mean, I think also it's interesting when you look at it slightly in comparison, again, with the Mikra Bikurim that we say a few psukim earlier, because here there's also really no focus on the Mikdash, which is why also there's a machloket about where you actually say this.
And whether or not it's in practice today when we are absent of the Mikdash.
Exactly, because here, Hashkifa mima'on kodshecha min hashamayim, meaning it's not placed in the Mikdash per se, which is very different from the Mikra Bikurim, which is very clearly said, right? Either at the Sha'ar or inside. Right. And there we speak specifically about the Makom Asher Bachar Bo Hashem. Right. And so here we have something, I mean, in theory, somebody could do it in their house.
Yeah, and according to all opinions, Mikra Bikurim, Havat Bikurim is of course not practiced today, and therefore this declaration that you make when you bring the Bikurim is not in practice today, except we all, of course, ritually read those psukim and are familiar to us because they are the spine, the backbone of the Haggadah.
Right.
Because what do we do in the Mikra Bikurim? So in that speech act,
Arami Oved Avi, Vayared Mitzrayim, right? We have there this sort of this magical history tour that we do.
Right. I mean, it's incredible because what happens? And then why is this selected as the central text of the Haggadah? The person has Bikurim. You come, you settle the land, either you or your children or your grandchildren, and you have a crop, and you have to bring the first fruits of that crop up to the Mikdash in the basket. You know, this is, of course, very much associated with the holiday of Shavuot.
At least in Israel, in modern Israel.
Yeah. And you make this story. You say, you see these fruits? You see this basket of grapes? You know what this grapes mean? It means Yetziat Mitzrayim. How do I possibly grow grapes in the land of Israel? Arami Oved Avi. The Jewish people got stuck in Egypt. They were enslaved there. They were beaten and tortured and oppressed. And God took me out with a strong hand. And because he took me out and brought me to the land of Israel and gave me this land, I'm able to grow a grape. And therefore, my bringing of the first fruits is a sign that I'm connected to Yetziat Mitzrayim. Now, Rabbi Soloveitchik very famously pointed to this as the great challenge of Leil HaSeder. Because what do we know about anybody who could have possibly recited the Bikurim text?
They weren't actually there.
They weren't actually there. In order to have been in Eretz Yisrael, growing crops means that you were not one of those that were enslaved. That whole generation died out in the desert. So even if you were the first one in your family to grow a grape in the land of Israel, you were not personally enslaved in Egypt. And so much more so, your children, your children's children, down to us today. So why is this selected as the center text of the? We should probably say that these psukim themselves are not really the central text. These psukim themselves are the hook on which we hang the midrashic interpretation. Because what do we do in the Haggadah? We read a stitch of the pasuk, and then we read the passage from the Sifrei, right? From the midrash that interprets the pasuk, and it's the interpretation of the pasuk that kind of teases out the work of the impact of Shibud Mitzrayim, the enslavement, and Yetziat Mitzrayim, the redemption. But together, in very many Haggadot, the Haggadot are printed so that the psukim are in one color and the midrash in another, so the reader can differentiate what's the ur text and what's the interpretive text. But we all understand what that is. So Rabbi Soloveitchik says we choose this text because it's the first example that we have in the Torah. In other words, of somebody wrestling with this question of, it's true that I personally wasn't there. I mean, as a biographical statement, I was not there, but yet I have to imagine myself as I went out. And beyond that, on a day-to-day basis, the Jew is tasked with remembering Yetziat Mitzrayim, of understanding the impact of that great historical event and redemption for our life now. And in this context, let's be a little Zionist, it means our whole endeavor here in the land of Israel, long before we could imagine a state of Israel, but our whole endeavor here in the land of Israel is an acknowledgement that we're here because God took us out, because history was changed and altered in order to get us to this point. These are very, I'm thinking, we're recording. I don't know if your listeners understand, but this is not a live broadcast. We're recording this a few weeks in advance of Parshat Tavo.
We're on Rosh Chodesh Elul right now.
We're on Rosh Chodesh Elul, and we're, a day or two after the funeral for the six hostages who were, we can't say they were rescued, whose bodies were retrieved, and including this very moving, for us, English-speaking community, the very moving funeral of Hirsch, Poland Goldberg, and these things all take on a much greater resonance. Our existence here, and our moment in history, and the chain of events that have brought us here, going back to Yetziat Mitzrayim, going back to Avram Avinu. For me, this year, all of this has come, to very sharp focus. I don't know that I think about it in each pasuk during Kriyat Torah, but if you stop to think about it, it really presents itself. We keep bumping up against this idea. But Rabbi Soloveitchik's point is that we choose this text because it's an example of somebody who has to struggle with making meaning of history and then to put him or herself back into that history. As you said in the Haggadah, we imagine ourselves as if we went out from Egypt. That's the great task.
So all that is obviously incredibly resonant, right? We're living in the same reality, you and I. Mm-hmm. And I agree that, something, I think I've said it a few times this summer in a few different forums, but there's like two internal emotions that I am sort of like oscillating between this year. And one of them is seeing what we're going through right now and trying to deal with it as it is now and how it's part of like the immediate context of what's been going on in Israel in the past few years. And the other one is seeing it as part of like this broader movement of Jewish history. Mm-hmm. And there's days where that kind of perspective is actually crazy making, because then you feel stuck in sort of this never ending cycle and it's not actually helpful. And then there are days where that kind of perspective and seeing us on some sort of continuum is actually comforting. And it depends on the day, which one is which. But when I was thinking about this person, and again, I know we sort of started from the Trumot and Ma'asrot and we sort of jumped into Mikra Bikurim. I don't know why, by the way. I haven't totally understood why this is actually one of my favorite sections in all of Dvarim. I haven't really totally understood why. But this idea that you bring in the name of Rabbi Soloveitchik about how a person this is like the classic, as Pirkei Avot speaks about, like of knowing where you come from and maybe also knowing where you're going from here, but meaning it's grounding yourself in a broader story, which in itself is a very powerful act for the person. And as I said in the beginning, we're used to sort of having to verbalize all these things. But for me, I read it and I think about the biblical man, like for the first time having to open up his mouth. Like there's something really provocative about this when I read it within the original context in which it was given. And because you are obviously a world-renowned scholar in
world-renowned,
in Sha'agnon, I wanted to try and
in a very small world. I have some notoriety.
It's like when we say the famous Rav Soloveitchik. In a small world, this piece of Rav Soloveitchik is famous, but if you didn't read it, it's not famous.
There are other neighborhoods where there are other Soloveitchiks, and those other family members are the more famous ones.
Exactly. So the truth is that, please nobody be impressed, I'm only on page 3, but on the second page of Emet Me'eretz Titzmach of Rav Chaim Sabato, I read this 2 days ago, and I was just moved by how much it was exactly this. And it's, again, I don't really even know what everything's about yet, but it's speaking about the sort of like the lore of being from Chalib, of being from How do they say that in
from
English?
Aleppo.
Of being from Aleppo. And
He wasn't, Rav Chaim Sabato was not from Aleppo. His grandparents were from Aleppo, and they had moved to Cairo, and before he came as a little boy on Aliyah in the early 50s.
Exactly.
But
so that's
nevertheless, you can take the family out of Aleppo, but you can't take the Aleppo out of the family.
Exactly. So that's exactly what this passage is about, and it really connected for me to this piece of Mikra Bikurim. And he says, Savi zichrono livracha, I'll translate, my grandfather, Chacham michachmei Aram Tova haya, v'chol ha'ma'alot shemaninu bahem mitzuyonot hayu bo. He says they spoke about all the wonderful character traits of people who were from Aram Tova, and he says that my grandfather was one of these people. Af hu haya mitga'eh bi'iro. He also was proud of his city. Hatoar Chaleb yichus haya be'einav. That was a positive appellation to be called from Chaleb. She'izkir chacham michachmei Chaleb b'mefursamim haya kam mimkomo mipnei hakavod. Even when they would just mention these illustrious scholars, he would stand in his place. V'af al pi sheben 9 shanim yarad leMitzrayim. Even though when my grandfather was 9, he left and moved to Egypt. V'achrit yamav asa b'Yerushalayim, and then he moved to Yerushalayim. Yaches haya atzmo lechachmei Chaleb v'nimna imehem. Right? He would always say that he is originally from Chaleb. And בעיקר נתגאה בזקנו שמגדולי חכמי חלב נחשב, ואף בנו צאצאיו דווקא אותה גאווה חלבית. Even, right, his grandchildren, we were proud in that same way. אף על פי שלא אנו ולא הורינו ולא ראינו בעינינו מעולם לא עד חלב ולא עד תדף. Right? We never saw these places. לא ראינו בעינינו, אני אומר, כלומר ראיית עיניים לא ראינו, אבל ראיית הלב ראינו. Right? Meaning we never were in these places, but our heart saw these places. So lahavdil, right? But that description just literally brought up for me this piece about we broaden these categories of what it means to experience or be somewhere or see something.
And the sense of place, the role that sense of place has in Judaism. Now, for the Jew throughout 2,000 years of exile, that place, of course, was Eretz Yisrael and Yerushalayim, and the little child in Poland or in Morocco, turned his face to the east and put his feet together and prayed V'li Yerushalayim Yircha Barachamim Tashuv, even though they really had only the vaguest idea of where this place was and what it was like there, and what it, the reality of the land of Israel. But it was this in the child's imagination, it was Oz, it was Neverland, it was Wonderland, it was Narnia, it was all the magical ideas. For Judaism, in Jewish children's literature and in Yiddish and Hebrew, you mentioned my work with Agnon, there was no need to invent a fantasy world, which is so omnipresent in children's literature. This idea that if you go to the back of the wardrobe, the back of your closet, you can get to another world, or if you
walk
go
through a cave.
We walk through a cave. You walk through the looking glass. You fall down a rabbit hole. A little pixie dust, and straight to the first star and onward. Right at the first star and onward to morning. In Jewish imagination, there's no such place. There's no such fantasy land because it was built in. It was Eretz Yisrael, and it was as technicolor as Dorothy's Oz. If Poland was black and white, the imagination that you could find a magical cave that would whisk you away to the land of Israel, you would walk out into magical technicolor. So that idea is very much
Mitzrayim is our black and white.
Yeah. But apropos of what you read from Rav Sabato, Agnon, of course, was from this little town called Buchach, which is today in western Ukraine, tiny little place. And but his children were born in Germany during his period living there. They were born in the early 1920s, and then as little children they come to live in Yerushalayim. And his daughter, who was his literary executor and who was responsible for publishing all of his posthumous works and working with him towards the end of his life and editing, and very late in life, she made a visit back to Buchach, where she was received as like a celebrity. The daughter of the great Hebrew author Agnon, who would come, and there's a street there where his family's house had been. There's an Agnon street in Buchach, and there's a bust. And she said, she'd never been here, but she'd been walking its streets her whole life. In other words, she didn't feel she was going to someplace. She felt she was going to a place where she knew every nook and cranny because she had been living in them in the imaginative world that her father had created in his literature. So that's an extension. What Sabata writes about Chalab and what she mentions about Buchach, and what the Jewish imagination was for the land of Israel is there, but we see it's here, right? In other words, these psukim about Bikurim and about Viduy Ma'asrot have this deep visceral connection to the land of Israel. But then for the Jew who's connected to the land of Israel, not reading this from abroad, but actually practicing the mitzvot here, bringing his Bikurim, bringing his saying his Viduy Ma'asrot, he's now simultaneously connected to a different time and place, and that's looking backwards to the Egypt experience, because we understand that our reality here and now is connected to everything that happened to us throughout our times. You had asked me to say a few words about some figure of importance to me, and I thought of, I've been very fortunate throughout my long career to have worked now for 30 years, mostly, with Rabbi Chaim Bravender, after having been a student in what was then Yeshivat HaMiftar, before coming on Aliyah. So I guess probably most people are familiar with the name Bravender. They know there's a school which is colloquially called Bravenders. So he often jokes they must think Bravender's the guy who gave the money. People continue to call it Bravenders. But Rabbi Chaim Bravender was born in Brooklyn, and he was educated in America, the Yeshiva Flatbush and at Yeshiva University, and at a young age, shortly after getting married in his early 20s, he came on Aliyah with his young bride, and they settled in Yerushalayim. And he was pursuing a doctorate at the Hebrew University, and he was simultaneously learning in a kollel. And after the 6-Day War, there was this incredible influx of Americans and Jews of all stripes and people that were, discovering or rediscovering their connection to Jewish life and to Jewish learning. And this was, what many people colloquially call, although he never does, colloquially called the flourishing of the Baal Tshuva movement in America and here in Israel.
I think it was also the beginning of the gap year.
And it was the beginning.
That started after the 6-Day War, from what I remember.
Even though there had been some American boys, no girls, who had come, there were some women, young women, that had come to Machon Gold.
Right.
Which was then a different
remember that
kind of
Rabbi
program.
Lamb actually was very influential in making that.
There were all types of people. The history
War.
of people coming. Yes, Rabbi Lamb was one, but there had been a small trickle of people that had come to learn in a small number of yeshivot or institutions, but there was no the idea that we have today of schools that really only cater to American kids or British kids, and where the instruction is in English and etc. That all postdates the 6-Day War. Mm-hmm. There were some students that had come to Yeshivat Keren B'Yavne, and even some to Merkaz Harav. But anyway, so he comes, and after the 6-Day War, because he was an American, together with one other person, Rabbi J. Miller, since they were these Americans in this otherwise Israeli kollel, the idea was, let's start a program for these Americans that are coming through, and these backpackers and these questioners and these seekers. And this men's program evolves and breaks away from that original kollel and becomes Yeshivat HaMiftar, called after the Givat HaMiftar neighborhood in Yerushalayim. And in 1976, they launch a program for women called Michlelet Bruria, which was, of course, famously the first institution to teach Talmud to women. And one of his main associates in that endeavor, of course, was Dr. Malka Bina of Matan. We're here on the Matan podcast, who then went on to leave there to create Matan. Mm-hmm. And of course, at the time, it was revolutionary. Now, now when we think about women learning Gemara, it seems so passé. No, even though there are places that don't do it, but the idea that it exists, it's just a fact on the ground.
Yeah.
Michal Brui, of course, at some point evolves into Midrashet Lindenbaum. The institutions come under the auspices of the Or Torah network with Rabbi Riskin, who had come on Aliyah at some point later, and Rabbi Bravender headed these institutions for many, many, many years. At some point, he and I created our organization called Atid, which has done a whole variety of projects and initiatives in Jewish education. And perhaps today our most well-known is webyeshiva.org, which is exactly what it sounds like. Long before the rest of the world discovered Zoom during the pandemic, online interactive learning, according to what came to be colloquially known, much to his chagrin, as the Bravender method. And that Bravender method, both for men and for women, was this idea of taking novices to Jewish learning and giving them the skills, giving them the keys to have meaningful, deep learning with the text, not about it, but it. And that's, in brief, the contours of his career. He has long taught, aside from teaching Gemara, like Rosh Yeshiva do, he always had this emphasis on studying Chumash, on studying Chumash, particularly Chumash and Rashi. He often speaks that his father, when he was a young boy in Brooklyn, in a world where Torah study wasn't, what it is today when we think of Brooklyn, his father's, commitment to Chumash and Rashi, to knowing, right? He's often said that his father was a worker. His father wasn't a scholar and a rabbi, but he often says that his father knew every Rashi in Chumash Baal Peh, and that made an impact on him, and his own ongoing commitment to trying to wrestle with reading the parsha and understanding the parsha. He's taught the parsha. We have online hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, thousands probably, of parsha shiurim. They're available on our website. They're available on YU Torah, and you can go each parsha and see these things. And sometimes you'll see that he, this year, maybe for this parsha, he'll be talking about a particular topic that he talked about once before. I can see in the archives. Is he repeating himself, as every teacher could be forgiven for doing? No, never. He's always coming up with something new. I mean, he'll claim that it's not that he came up with something new. It's he forgot what he had said,
17
previously.
Years ago. Yeah.
But that's something that's been very, almost by osmosis, has obviously had an impact on how I read text and how I think about it and what questions I bring to it and how I do that kind of, again, a term he would never use, the meaning making. Mm-hmm. It's that insight that I mentioned a few minutes ago about what does it mean to read Mikra Bikurim and to think about the Jews' place in history in the land of Israel today in light of these things. That's a kind of thinking that no doubt has been influenced by my long association with him. So in terms of, let's look now at this Viduy Ma'asrot question, this recitation of, God, I got it all right. So there's a question. This term, this title, Viduy Ma'asrot, the confession of the tithes, that's not a biblical phrase. That's a nickname that Chazal give to this ritual. And again, maybe just parenthetically, we should say whether or not this is still in practice today is a machlokas. The Rambam in Hilchot Maaser Sheni says that even today, without Beit HaMikdash, this halacha still applies. Because
that's clearly how your hosts were paskening when you went and it was the first time.
So the Rambam says that it is in practice because, after all, we still do Trumot and Masrot today. And even if today our Trumot and Masrot are only Dirabanan, they're not Dirabanan because of the Mikdash. They're Dirabanan, or the absence of the Mikdash, are Dirabanan because of the absence of a majority of the people in the land of Israel. And it's very possible that in the next number of years we're going to go back to a stage where mitzvot tluyot ba'aretz go back to being of Torah force. This is a much more complicated halachic topic, but in all cases, the Rambam says, no, this mitzvah, in other words, if we give ma'asrot today dirabanan, then there's a rabbinic obligation to do Biur Ma'asrot and Viduy Ma'asrot, to recite this text twice every 7 years. The Ravid disagrees, and it's a machloket l'maaseh throughout much of Jewish history, and certainly in Chutz La'aretz, Jews did not do this. But inherently, there's no reason that a Jew sitting in Poland or in Woodmere couldn't say this. Maybe they were here for a visit and they did Trumot Ma'asrot, but even if you didn't, somebody who has no income is still supposed to file
taxes.
Their tax form. And the tax form says, I had no income and I paid zero taxes. Asiti kechol asher tzivitani. I did everything I was supposed to do. I had no income. I didn't have to pay taxes. I didn't pay taxes. I fulfilled my obligation. So whether or not what the Achronim say to do, many disfavored the practice for various reasons, and others have said, no, it should be done, and minimally it should be done, whether or not there's an actual obligation, minimally it can be done as a minhag, and I think in the last number of cycles, it has become somewhat increasingly popular. Maybe perhaps a sociologist could tell us which communities it's become more popular in, and the minhag seems to be to either recite it with the Ta'amei HaMikra, or even to take a Sefer Torah out of the Aron and to read the psukim from these psukim from Perek Kavav. And in my shul here in Efrat, this is what we've done, at least all the years I've been here.
It's like in Shacharit in the morning?
At Mincha. The minhag is that on Mincha, on the last day the seventh day of Pesach, which is for us the last day, after Mincha to recite. We don't take out the Sefer Torah. We have somebody recites the psukim with the Ta'amei HaMikra, and other people can say it along. And it's always a good opportunity for me to give a little drasha about this topic and to remind us of these themes.
I also just want to add one other piece, which is that Mina Torah, the Trumot and Ma'asrot are taken from different grape products and also and wheat products, right? Midrabanan, it's on all fruits and vegetables, right? So that's just notice that's different. And when we spoke earlier about the bikurim, and that's from Shivat HaMidim.
Yeah, that's why I mentioned grapes as my example.
Exactly. So just clarifying.
But this idea that Chazal have that it's a Viduy Ma'asrot, it's a confession. So of course, colloquially, both in Hebrew and in English, confession infers what?
That we did something wrong.
Sin.
Yeah.
Confession goes with it. What do you confess? Right? 100 people surveyed, top 5 answers on the board. Right? What's confessed? Right? A sin.
Yeah.
But what are we saying here? There's no sin here. This is, on the contrary, it is a catalog of everything you got right. So Rabbi Bravender often points our attention to a sforno here. The sforno says on the pasuk Biarti HaKodesh Min HaBayit, B'chatoenu uva'avonot avotenu husra ha'avoda mihabchorot asher lahem hayu ru'uyot trumot u'masrot. What's the chet? In other words, hidden in this declaration of I did it, I got it 100%, A+. Between the lines, the Sforno says, nevertheless, there's a sin that's hiding in the background. And even with the success of doing this mitzvah, we have to remember that there's a colossal historic failure. And this is an idea that for some reason, if somebody were to listen to a large number of Rabbi Bravender's Parsha Shurim, it's an idea, a theme that repeats itself over and over again. Because of the Chet HaEgel, the whole system of how the Mikdash operates was changed. According to the original plan, who was meant to serve in the Mikdash? The Bechor. In each family, like they used to say about the Italian Catholic families, they had big families, and one son would always be sent to become a priest. That was like the aspiration in every family. Whether this is true or not, it's a stereotype. And I mean no disrespect to Italian Catholic families, but there was this stereotype that in each big Italian Catholic family, one, or maybe Irish family, one kid would be given over like like Shmuel HaNavi would be given over to the church to work as a priest. In each family, the Bechor would be dedicated to the Mikdash. Would he get Trumot U'Masrot? Not clear. Maybe each person would have then been supported by his family. With Trumot Ma'asrot, this whole system of supporting the religious workforce,
right.
the religious workforce is it's not like this idea of like the landed nobility where the peasants have to kick up taxes to the rich. That's not what Trumot Ma'asrot is. Trumot Ma'asrot is, in our religious society, we're centered around the Beit HaMikdash. The Kohanim and the Leviim are the servants in the Beit HaMikdash. They work not only in the Mikdash, in the actual performance of the sacrifices and everything that goes on there, but they're also the educational core. And therefore, they need to be supported. And that's what Trumot Ma'asrot are doing. But maybe there was a different model in place originally, wherein each family would send one person to do the work, and each family supports its own. Mm-hmm. Or maybe they would have been receiving some form of Trumot Ma'asrot, the each Bechor. But after Chet HaEgel, after the sin of the golden calf, everything is rearranged. And the job is given to this one Shevet. And therefore, you need a whole system to support those people, because everyone in that Shevet is going off instead of just one representative of the family. So this idea that Sforno says, when I say I did all the Trumot Ma'asrot the way I'm supposed to do, but maybe giving Trumot Ma'asrot, at least the way that it's in practice in reality, is only a b'di'evet. Mm-hmm. It's not the way it's supposed to be. And therefore, the very fact that we have to give Trumot Ma'asrot is an indication that there was sin. And that's why Chazal call it Vidui, because there's a confession. Because even as we say we got it right, hidden between the lines is the echo of what went wrong.
So it's a little bit original sin for me. But I think that there's another way that it also could be flipped, which is that I understand that the word vidui, certainly in the way that we use it now, is confession of sin. However, there is another possible path. It's just that we are used to today when we speak about ourselves, or today in past hundreds of years, that it means that we're going to reflect negatively. But a telling right. could be positive, right? Somebody could get up and say, "Doing well, I got this," But again, I don't want to say, I'm not saying something as bold as Christian influence, but meaning in this religious perspective that sometimes we have, is that if we're speaking about ourselves, it's clearly going to be reflecting something negative. And while I think that that's a powerful idea in explaining the word vidui, I think that in the context of, I would even say in the Pshat context of the parsha, I feel like it's dafka, it's this positive moment of being like, I'm checking everything out, making sure I did everything, and in fact, I have done it all. Right. And the vidui might just mean some sort of, I'm laying it out there, but I'm laying out there that I've done okay.
So,
just an alternative.
Brucha shekivant.
Okay.
Because this is butts up against how Rabbi Soloveitchik interprets it. He does not quote the Sforno, but he certainly rejects it. And he points out that vidui need not just be the litany of sin, but vidui is a self-assessment. Yeah. Right? It's this kind of cataloging and detailing of one's self-awareness of what you got right and what you got wrong. And in one of the drashot, in the Chamesh drashot, the addresses that he delivered to the Mizrahi on themes of Zionism, but
it was originally in English?
No, it was originally, these were drashot that were, originally they were all delivered in Yiddish.
Oh, okay.
And they were first published in Yiddish. They were first published as 4 drashos, 4 sermons, and then a 5th was added later, and then it was translated to Hebrew and translated to English, and now I'm holding the old edition. There's a newer edition which has, I think, some other material added in, but in one of the drashot he says the following about this question of why is this a vidui, why is this confession, what's the sin here if you're saying I did everything right? And he says the following, and it's such a beautiful idea now, just very shortly before Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. He says, concealed within this terminology, this idea of Viduy Ma'asrot, confession, is a fundamental principle of Jewish thinking on repentance and confession. Repentance is grounded in 2 principles. Number 1, on the power within man to accuse himself and his ability to see himself as unworthy and inferior. In the confessional declaration of Yom Kippur, but thou art righteous in all that has come upon us, for thou hast acted truthfully, but we have wrought unrighteousness. The wonderful power of total unresolved self-accusation is expressed. But then he says, number 2, repentance is grounded on the ability of each individual to cleanse himself, to grasp that the boundless spiritual forces hidden away within the human personality, including that of even the greatest sinner, drive one towards return to God. On the ability of man to raise himself to the greatest heights, if he but wishes it, though he has sunk to the abysmal depths of impurity. And then he says the second principle is as important as the first. So confession only has meaning. He doesn't say this exactly, although I think this is the idea that he's resting on. If in the Maimonidean formula of what constitutes tshuva, if you cannot fulfill your obligation to repent unless you have Kabbalah al ha'atid, so without a sense that you can get it right, there's really little point in cataloging Viduy in the conventional sense of the litany of my sins. So that's why this is called Viduy. Saying, I got it right, I did everything I was supposed to do, asiti kechol asher tzivitani, I fulfilled every mitzvah, I didn't leave one detail out. That's also a form of Viduy, because Viduy is not confession, it's an honest, brutally honest self-assessment. But there can be no honest self-assessment unless you have the self-confidence to also understand and appreciate what your capacities are and what your successes are. Well, we look at the Chumash and we look at the parsha and we look at the season of the year that we're in, and we look at the year that we've just had as a Jewish people, and we're confronted by all of these complexities, and we have to try to figure out, where do I fit into it? And this history that's unfolding before me, is this the history as it's supposed to be? Or does it mean that something went terribly wrong along the way, in which case I have to imagine, a different future? And we also have to do Viduy for the Jewish people. I'm not here speaking politically. Yeah. But we have to do Viduy for each person. Has to do Viduy for the Jewish people. What have we gotten right? What have we gotten wrong? And how did we get here? And what's hiding between the lines of our existence that can help us understand both the good and the bad, in order to come to a much fuller assessment as individuals, as families, as communities, and as a nation and a world.
I think that, again, if we put aside the way that we have sort of traditionally, communally elongated this tshuva period, also in Elul, it's that I think that the correlation between the confessional and the positive future looking is also preserved in the way the holidays are. Meaning Yom Kippur is one day, right? Meaning we have Aseret Yimei Tshuva and we have Elul, but Yom Kippur is one day in a season that's Rosh Hashanah, which is looking upwards towards God, and through Sukkot, which is a whole different kind of Avodat Hashem.
Right.
And I think
the long arc from as you said, we're recording this on the morning of Rosh Chodesh Elul. The long arc from that first Tkiyat Shofar, until taking down the sukkah.
Yes.
We should say until Simchat Torah, which is going to be very different this year. It's going to change the shape of that arc.
Yeah. And that arc has become a lot of, as you said, klopping al chitz, meaning we've elongated that feeling of the cleansing. I think people feel they need that, but I think that at its root, and this is not me just with some like glib positive pop psychology, but at its root, the confessional, that negative, that all the things I did wrong, I think is supposed to have a slightly smaller, in terms of the ratio, a slightly smaller place than, okay, where am I going from here? Because when we get stuck in the quagmire of the mess ups, and I agree, right? I mean, also spoke about it in my introduction to this episode. When we speak about the mess ups that we've really made in the past few years, we can get stuck, and being able to look forward is really what is going to enable us to get out of this.
My wife's father, Dr. Ed Goldstein, Zichrono Livracha, also from Brooklyn, was the bar mitzvah teacher of young Chaim Bravender. So the family connection goes way
deep.
back. So his interest in Kriyat Torah goes back to my wife's father, and that's why these things are, I guess, maybe rather precious to me, even though I was connected to him before I entered the family. That Yom Kippur is not a sad day.
Yeah.
Children often think it is because you can't eat and you can't, it's a lot of davening and it's a lot of time in shul, and and since of course it bears so many superficial resemblances to Tisha B'Av.
Yeah.
We just had Tisha B'Av, and here's another day which looks a lot like, from a child's perspective, and even from an adult's perspective, looks a lot like Tisha B'Av.
Except you could do less. Yeah.
And right, and at least on Tisha B'Av you can use your phone, but you can use the internet. So people think it's a sad day. It's not.
Yeah.
It's a serious day.
Yeah.
But it's a happy day, as of course we know. Chazal say it was the happiest Tu B'Av and Yom Kippur, the happiest days of the year. And anybody who reads the davening carefully and reads the Seder Avodah carefully understands Emet Ma Nehedar, how uplifting, right? Awe is uplifting, right? But too many of us have misimpressions, or we get stuck in these kind of juvenile notions that, even though cognitively we know it's not true, but yet it sticks with us that, the Chagim are coming.
Yeah.
No, we should say, what a great opportunity to be uplifted, to experience that awe once again.
Yeah, I guess maybe I'll just add also about my father, Zichron Livracha, that he was always the chazan of our community, and we lived in a very small place, so being the chazan was a very big deal. And I always experienced the Yamim Noraim as uplifting, meaning it was, my father would be front and center, and we would buy new clothing. And I only discovered much later in life that, the serious part, that's true. That did need to be discovered. But like this scary, negative, threatening thing, which I adopted for a very short period of time until I also just shed that right off.
Has to outgrow that.
Yeah, I just shed that right off. And I guess I'll just wish all of our listeners, although we have some time to go from here, that this be, I think everyone's looking for something different right now. I think we all need, I think the shofar is sort of going to maybe channel all different kinds of tefillot and all different cries that we're all experiencing. And I hope that this will be a meaningful period. And I think that also last year, we went through this whole intensity, right? This whole intense period. And then we sort of felt like we had no idea what was coming. Right. And I wish for us this year that we'll be able to go through this period and feel like it was effective in whatever way that was supposed to be.
Yes. And we hope that all of the current traumas will have ended by the time our listeners are hearing this. And we'll all have a ketiva v'chtima tova.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.